Hello world builders and welcome to the archive. In today's episode of the workshop, I'll be focusing on tips and aspects on how to go about creating fictional races for your settings and stories. This episode will also be more generalized as to set the groundwork for what these races may look like and potentially how they'll develop. Now let's get started. In previous episodes, we went over some basics for world building and took the initial steps by creating the world itself and establishing some rules for the world and general ideas as to what environments will be present. Generally speaking, the world we've begun working on so far will incorporate Earth-like biomes such as deserts and forests, but there is a homebrew one I'm calling Arkan, which serve as volatile regions where magic runs rampant. And with this set, we can start to think about the people who will inhabit this world. The first thing you should consider is how many races you would like to include, and you should ask yourself if adding another race is something you want to do or if it will serve the story you may wish to tell, as you need to take into account how the existence of this new race not only requires more work to develop them, but also how it may impact the other races present and their cultures as well. This question is doubly important to ask if you plan to use more traditional fantasy races such as orcs, elves, and dwarves, as others will draw comparisons to other iterations of such races. An example we can consider is, say we have a human kingdom that primarily gets its ore from a nearby mountain range, but you'd like to include dwarves and have them settle that same mountain. Now you need to take into consideration how the dwarves' control of ore influences the human kingdom and how the relations might play out. Do the dwarves and humans establish a trade agreement or some form of alliance, or does humanity's growing need for resources eventually lead to conflict? The next thing that should be considered is having diversity within a species. Often in media, we see species all adopt a dominant trait and are almost defined solely by this trait. As an example, we can look at the Klingons from Star Trek and how their defining characteristic is their warlike nature. Doing so makes your races feel one-dimensional, bland, and at times predictable. So it's important to create differences in faiths, ideologies, and so on within a group to add diversity and sources of potential conflict if you so choose. With some foundational ideas set, let's break down our races into two categories: homebrew and established. Homebrew races are those that are unique to the setting or rarely appear in fiction, and established races pull from mythology, other fictional settings, and so on, and we've already touched on a couple, including elves, dwarves, orcs, goblins, and many, many more. We'll tackle different aspects in creating both, starting with homebrews. With homebrew races, the goal is to create something as unique as possible and something that fits within your established rules. To start, establish if this new race will be humanoid in nature or take inspiration from other organisms such as spiders or snakes, which have different body structures. A lot of races tend to be humanoid in nature and often alter a physical characteristic to make them feel more distinct, such as pointed ears for elves or short stature for dwarves. Going with the humanoid route is easier, as humanoid races tend to follow similar rules to that of humans when it comes to things like diet, circadian rhythms, and so on, but you should certainly play around with such qualities and alter them to fit your needs. If you go the non-humanoid route, you'll need to consider additional factors. For example, if you're looking to make a crab-like species, you should also ask yourself, how do they eat, what's their diet, do they sleep, and if so, how and where, and how do they travel, do they do so through the ocean, or do they travel on land? I will note that non-humanoid races work better in visual mediums, as there is less work the reader needs to do in order to visualize them. Adding non-humanoid races also increases the weirdness of your world and story, which can be a turnoff for some audiences, so that should be taken into account, but it shouldn't deter you from experimenting, as there are many successful series that incorporate non-human races and characters. Next, we should start to think about the body structure and head of the homebrew species. I would argue in favor of developing the physical aspects of your species before delving too deeply into culture, ideologies, and so on. Using humans as an example, we developed our physical structures prior to our intelligence. As such, we should really take into account how the environment applies certain pressures to affect the evolution of a species. For example, ask how the environment may impact features such as skin tone, which you can settle on by asking if the species needs camouflage to avoid predators, where they're located in your world, and how much sunlight they are receiving. Other physical features also depend on environmental factors, such as if the species will inhabit trees, which would require them to maybe be more monkey-like with tails and opposable thumbs to help them navigate the terrain. Overall size can also be taken into account and help determine strength, endurance, and even how much food they'll need to fuel themselves, if they even need to eat in the first place. For the head, there are a ton of features that you can adjust aside from pointed ears or adding tusks, and take into consideration what this new species will eat and what's available to them. Will they need canines to consume meat, or are they herbivores which require a different jaw structure? You can also ask if they're insectoid and may need antennae to communicate, or maybe that they're a bat-like and have larger ears to aid with echolocation. There are so many factors to consider and play around with to develop your own race. Some other factors you can consider are reproduction, growth stages, and hybrids. With production, you may want to take into account how a species reproduces. Is it sexually or asexually? Sexual reproduction involves the creation of an offspring through the combining of genetic information between two organisms, whereas asexual reproduction has organisms create genetically similar or identical copies of themselves without the genetic material from another organism. With sexual reproduction, genetic diversity within a species is far greater than what can be found within species that rely on asexual reproduction due to the mixing and combining of genetic information. Another factor to consider is reproductive strategies. These strategies also fall under two categories, R selection and K selection. R selection involves having a greater number of offspring to counterbalance high mortality rates among offspring. With this strategy, species often spend less or no resources tending to their offspring either, given the sheer quantity. K selection involves having less offspring as a result of lower mortality rates, and unlike R selection, this allows for the parents to dedicate far more time to their offspring to ensure that the few that they have survive. When it comes to growth stages, you should consider how many stages each race will have and how the transition between stages occurs. For example, humans generally adhere to prenatal, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood development stages, which occur as an irreversible and constant increase in size, which peaks around the age of 20, but can vary from person to person. But not every organism follows this form of development. Another example is metamorphosis, which occurs in species such as butterflies, in which a caterpillar emerges from an egg, and once it is fully grown, it secures itself within a cocoon to enter the pupa or chrysalis stage. Within the cocoon, the caterpillar releases digestive juices, which break down its body into tissue cells that allow it to reform into a butterfly and emerge from the cocoon as an adult. Playing around with the development stages of your races could be a great avenue to add a bit of realism or even weirdness to your races, such as having elves undergo metamorphic changes, or go even more fantastical and have your dwarves form stone cocoons that allow them to progress to adulthood. Lastly, you might want to consider whether hybrids between your fictional species is possible, and whether or not those hybrids can produce fertile offspring. Taking this into account can lead to formation of new species similar to half-elves or half-orcs, and it can greatly impact the demographics of your world throughout its history. For example, if you have elves and humans and they can produce viable offspring, the half-elf population could be greater and result in new cultures or even discrimination, depending on how races view hybrids. Next, with established races, there is certainly a pro and con with using them or taking inspiration from them. Because they are far more common in media, parables will immediately be drawn, but it is far easier to incorporate said races into settings given that there is a solid amount of sources to pull from, lessening the workload. Going with an established race also allows you the opportunity to subvert expectations, but be careful as to not add a race or edit an existing one solely for the purpose of subversion, as that can cheapen it. For example, if you want to add elves to the setting, maybe have them be subservient to humans, or maybe they could be more barbaric and tribalistic. And if you're considering subverting expectations or making extensive changes to a race such as elves, consider if those changes might warrant making it a new race entirely, as having a race called elves, but having them share little to no qualities commonly associated with elves, may create some disconnect with your audience. With some general tips covered, I'll take what we discussed so far and apply it to creating some races for the workshop world. To start, let's have 3 or 4 established races and then work to make a homebrew one to show all the previous suggestions in action. We'll first develop more established races and place them in the world and start to formulate ways in which the characteristics most often associated with said races are potentially influenced by the environment. For this, we'll be using humans, elves, and furballs as foundations to build from. We'll start with humans and keep things super simple, and they'll share common qualities we often see expressed in other fantasy or sci-fi worlds, including, but not limited to, being the most populous race, being adaptable, diverse, and particularly ambitious. We'll leave the body shapes and head shapes unchanged, and no notable physical features will be added or altered. In terms of where they'll be found, we'll place them in the central and northern regions of the western continent and the central and southern regions of the eastern continent. We'll use these locations and their respective biomes to help determine physical characteristics such as skin tone, and in a later episode, culture. With this, there will be a couple of human ethnicities that have some physical differences, but will generally keep the core qualities mentioned prior. So, for example, the human populations as a result of less direct sunlight, whereas those in the eastern deserts will have darker skin tones as a result of more UV exposure. Next, we'll consider the Elves. I'm thinking of having two ethnic groups for the Elves, one in the central to northern regions of the eastern continent, and one that roams the savannas and deserts to the south. The central to northern elves we will keep relatively the same to other elves in contemporary fantasy, with lanky builds, long pointed ears, pale skin tones, and having them be adept with magic. With the savanna and desert elves, however, will deviate a bit and they'll have shorter, pointed ears, darker skin tones, large eyelashes to contend with sunlight and debris, and curly to coily hair. And then lastly, for the established races, we'll look at Furballs. Furballs tend to be tall humanoids with vibrant skin tones and fur across the body. They'll all be placing them in forested and jungle biomes, so we'll have their fur be a bit shorter and have more earthly tones to fit their environment. We'll create two ethnic groups, one based in more forested regions and the second being in jungles. The forest furbolgs will be quite similar to the ones we see in media such as D&D, but the jungle furbolgs will be smaller and have opposable toes and even shorter fur. This will allow them to navigate the jungles by swimming from branches and jumping through trees. For a homebrew race, the central island isn't inhabited yet, so let's fill that in. Given how volatile magic is in Arcan biomes, I think we can work in that magic has a mutagenic effect, and we can consider that it's an island, so let's base this new race off of a species we might commonly find in such environments. Let's say a crab or some other crustacean. So we currently have a crustacean species affected by volatile magic that runs rampant on the island. With that, we can start to apply previously mentioned tips, and we'll start to construct a general idea for their body and head shape. Given the hostile environment and mutagenic effects of powerful magic, we could have this new race be rather large and have durable chitin for defense, with multiple legs and with arms with either pinchers or hands to allow for offense and the use of tools. For the head, it will extend outwards in humanoid fashion so as to not be embedded within the chitinous body. A large round piece of chitin will rest at the top of the head to protect the head from magic strikes and any potential predators or other threats. They'll also come in various colors and patterns to match the large coral growths that dot the island. For reproduction, the species will produce sexually by having the females lay eggs in shallow waters, and the males will fertilize them. The species will take on an R selection strategy as their offspring are vulnerable to predators after hatching, and for growth stages they will molt, growing in size and shedding their shells until they reach adulthood. With this, we've established the races of this new setting and cover some potential questions to ask in terms of their look and biology. And with this, we've set the foundation for these races and their cultures, which we'll explore in future videos, along with things like faiths, religions, naming conventions, and so on. I hope this episode has helped you better understand how to start developing the intelligent species of your fictional settings and how to lay the groundwork for building upon them. Join me for that next episode where we'll begin to formulate the deities of this world, which play a part in religions or lack thereof for these new races. Thank you for taking the time to watch this guide, and feel free to like, subscribe, and comment any of your ideas, suggestions, or feedback down below. Take care, and happy world building.